episode is a vital conversation on equity in early learning. We're honored to have Dr. Tameka Ardrey, Dr. Ebonyse Mead, and Gryphon House President Dr. Rebecca Berlin joining us today. At a time when DEI initiatives are under attack and equity feels increasingly out of reach, these women continue to push forward with honesty, courage, and unwavering commitment. In this episode, we'll explore what equity truly means in an early childhood setting and how educators can make a difference, even in difficult times. Let's get started. Welcome to Early Childhood Chapters. My name is Emily Garman. I'm your host today. We have a very special episode. We have two guests and our in-house moderator, Rebecca Berlin from Gryphon House. So I'll kick it off to Dr. Mead first. Please introduce yourself. Let us know who you are, where you are, what book you've written for Gryphon House.
Hi, everyone. My name is Dr. Ebonyse Mead. If you say that kind of fast, it sounds like you're saying Ebonyse Mead. That's not my name. It's Ebonyse Mead. But I'm very happy to be here with you today. I am assistant professor in the Department of Family and Consumer Sciences at Virginia State University, and I teach in the Family, Child, and Community Development track. I am also the adjunct professor at Wilmington University in Delaware. I teach in the online applied family science graduate program. So I'm very happy to be here with you all. Prior to that, this is how I know Dr. Ardrey. Together we worked at Georgia Southern University in their birth to kindergarten program. And we collaborated probably like the semester that I got there, I believe. We talked about collaborating on a book that we both used in our classes at Georgia Southern University. Building building equitable programs, the social justice approach, right? It was almost 2 years ago. So yeah, I'll turn it over to Dr. Ardrey to introduce herself.
So hello, Dr. Ardrey. I am excited to be here as well. I am currently the Early Childhood Program Director at Cape Fear Community College, and I'm also serving as interim director of our lab school. So that's been fun and exciting. I've been in the field of early childhood for 20 years now, particularly working with children traditionally labeled at risk and underprivileged.
And I'm Dr. Rebecca Berlin, and I am currently the president of Gryphon House. In that capacity, I have the ability to work with amazing authors like these two women and probably about 100 more. So it's my honor to kind of lead us in a discussion today. So let's just get started. So Dr. Ardrey, equity in general and in education is a concept that's often misunderstood, confused with equality. Can you share how you differentiate between the two? And how do you help educators shift this mindset?
So absolutely. I always like to point out the word equal and equality. And when we think about equal, we're thinking the same. And so if we're thinking about equality, we have to assume that everyone is starting out at the same place. Everyone has the same needs. So whatever we give them, it will suit everybody. To highlight the difference for educators, I like to use an example of perhaps going to a doctor's office. And let's say 3 different individuals go to the doctor's office. And one person may have an earache, one person may have a toothache, and somebody else may have like a gunshot wound, right? And the doctor gives everyone eardrops, right? It's equal, it's the same, but does it meet the needs of everyone? It does not, right? And so it's the same thing when we think about classrooms and our students, and when they show up, they come from different backgrounds, different experiences. They're exposed to different things. Some of them have early learning experiences. Some of them do not. And so we have to be mindful that we are meeting everyone at the point of their need. And so I think about equity as giving you what you need based on the context of your life. And equality would just be giving everyone the same thing, no matter where they come from, no matter what they need.
I appreciate that, because that is such an important concept to help people really understand those differences. Talk a little bit, speaking of mindsets, your book emphasizes that cultural inclusion should go beyond awareness and monthly celebrations. Can you share an example of what true culturally responsive teaching looks like in practice?
So I like to think of culturally responsive teaching as just teaching in context, right? Teaching in the context of the children, their lived experiences, their background. So for example, in a classroom, if you're doing transitions, it's simply using music that has the same rhythm, the beats, the tones that they're familiar to listen to at home. And so using those in your transitions every day. Or it may be that children speak different languages in your classroom. And so maybe in the morning, if you're having a morning group time or just greetings, right, you're using terminologies in those different languages. It's something that you do every single day on a routine basis, but you're just incorporating who they are within the practices.
Thank you. I love that idea, particularly about transitions, right? Because transitions are so difficult for everyone. I say if you ask 100 teachers what their top challenges are, usually transitions goes to the top, right? Because children are having to stop something and start something. And so making it meaningful and making there be a piece of familiar for those kids is so important. So I appreciate that. Dr. Mead, given the current political environment and the threats to DEI initiatives, what can educators and administrators realistically do to foster equity when facing funding cuts or even legal threats to this work?
So I think that's such an important question, just, particularly just given our time. I think there's three things that teachers and educators can continue to do. I think one of the first things is to really understand that equity work it takes critical self-reflection, right? We bring our whole selves to the work. And so even though there may be cuts to different programs that you're implementing or threats to those cuts, you can still do the personal work, right? That doesn't change. And the personal work has to continue to happen in order to effectively implement the things that you're doing in your programs or in your centers, right? Because again, you bring your whole selves to the work, right? It's, we often say that equity and, um, anti-bias or racial justice work isn't a destination. It's not like I went to this training and then I'm done, right? So I think there's three things that you can continue to do. One, you can continue to educate yourself, because as we are learning more about the current climate that we're in, we're learning more about ourselves as American citizens and people, right? So we can continue to educate ourselves about the history of this country, what those inequities look like, not just within our society, but how they translate to the educational system and the early education environment, right? Because it's the educational system, the United States, because I'm learning not to say America because there's other places like Central America and South America that also are American too, right? That's my privilege as an American citizen, right? So I'm acknowledging that. But in the United States, the education system is a microcosm of the larger inequities that we see within our society, right? And so I think one thing is to continue to educate yourself, continue to attend professional development, webinars that are not just focused on things like cultural humility. And don't get me wrong, cultural humility is very important, but really dive deep into understanding racial justice work. What does that look like? Racial justice and anti-racist practices, right? How does those practices and pedagogy, what does that actually look like in the classroom? Even if there is, threats about funding, you can still educate yourself on those types of things. And so I think education is one. I think engagement. The engagement that you do with families is very important. The engagement that you do with children are so important because you want to continue to build those authentic relationships. So you can do things like a cultural audit in your classroom. Like, how are you really being intentional about fostering an environment that's representative of diverse families and just representation that's in a non-stereotypical way, right? So the posters that you have in your class, or the bulletin boards, or what, all of those types of things, even in like the play area, does those items truly represent and make children feel seen, valued, and that they're welcome, and families as well. So the first thing I think is to continue education, continue that self-reflection. How do you show up as a racialized person, right, in relation to the children that are in your care, in relation to the families? Continue to have that authentic engagement, and then continue to evaluate the policies that you have in your program, the practices that you have in your program, because it's not just looking at things like suspension and expulsion and teacher-child interactions, right? But it's like, what policies do I have in my program that could inadvertently create inequity, right? And I'll give an example. It's higher education related, not early childhood education related, but the analogy still holds the same. And so one of my colleagues would have an assignment, or her students in her sociology course would have to visit, some type of nonprofit organization to try to get a better understanding of the organization, what they do, how do you apply sociological concepts. And what she found was that some students were not doing the assignment. And some of the students were not doing the assignment because they didn't have time to go to an organization, right? Because they worked, right? It's not that they were just, not following instructions and didn't want to do it, but they worked and they couldn't go. And when she dug deeper to find out, like, hey, what's going on? Why aren't you all completing the assignments? She found out that even in her good intention to expose students to the nonprofit world and, give them some experiential learning, her policy was inequitable, right? And so again, just being able to look at the policies and practices that you have that on the surface, they may seem, to have good intention, but, in practice, they may be creating or perpetuating inequities.
Thank you for lifting that out, because I do think those barriers, those unintentional barriers, I've often think about times where we say we are going to do and we talk about family engagement in a minute. You spoke about it earlier. We're going to do a literacy evening for families, and we're going to do it at 6 o'clock, right? And so 6 o'clock is when many families are still working. Many families don't have access to reliable transportation or bus lines, and so by putting those things in place, those are barriers to those parents participating.
Exactly.
Thinking about those policies and those intended or unintended consequences, almost like, to be able to do X, what do you need to be able to do that assignment, to come to that meeting?
Right. And I also think, like, we have to, in examining, our policies, I think we have to be creative, right? And what we can do to remove those barriers. Like, if we think about the childcare system, like, there's barriers in place that prevent families from receiving the childcare that they need, right? So, some programs, if you think about subsidy, like some programs you have to work, or if you get a scholarship, maybe you can get a scholarship for a couple of months while you look for work. But then what happens if you don't find work, right, within that time frame, right? So and it's like thinking about, well, what can we do to be creative? So is there funding? Like, if you're using funding to have scholarships, then maybe some of that funding can be used to help to have more family childcare, or help people pay, like, family members to, care for the kids while, people are looking for work. Like, just being creative and trying to remove some of those systemic barriers that are in place that keep families, in this perpetual state of inequities and like disparate outcomes as well. So
yeah, I appreciate that, because I was like, there is not we try in the United States to have a one size fits all response to things, and there our communities, our people, our states are so diverse that we can't have a one size fits all. So I appreciate you.
Well, Rebecca, I mean, like, don't get me started. Now, that's the problem with America anyway. This idea, with the United States, this idea that there's this, homogenized view that everyone should be the same, right? This is why we're in the mess that we're in now with the political climate that we're in. And, it's this anti-DEI, because the United States thinks that, we should be a homogenized society. And that's very counter to the ideals of the United States. So.
You mentioned family engagement, so I want to circle back to that. And family engagement is a key theme in this book, and it's so important, right? Because I always think about the child does not come to school, come to childcare, come into the community as just the child. They come within the system of that family. And so I want you to just share a little bit about what are some of the most effective methods for educators, particularly those who come from non-marginalized communities, to build authentic relationships with families.
Like, family engagement means so much to me, just because children, they don't exist in a vacuum. They exist within the context of their families, their culture, and their communities, right? And I think when we understand that, I think the field of early childhood education needs to understand that concept. When I think about my own learning in my doctoral program, I took one class with family engagement, right? We often focus on the child, which is not wrong. But again, children don't exist in absence of their families. And so I think one thing we have to do is understand and view families from a strength-based perspective, right? I don't think we do enough of that. And acknowledging and respecting the strength and the assets that families bring to the space, right? Regardless of whatever adversities, or what that they may be experiencing, right? Understanding that families develop over time, they're resourceful, they're resilient. Like if we bring those concepts to the forefront of the work that we do when we're engaging with children already, then that helps build those authentic relationships. So I think we need kind of like a paradigm shift and a mind shift of how we view families, right? If we view families from a strength-based perspective and that they are integral parts of the child's development and not this add-on, right? It makes a world of a difference. So for me, I think it's, having this mind shift to, a strength-based approach, and understanding that whatever adversities that the family may be experiencing, like the family got the child to school on time. No matter if the mom came in a bonnet or in pajamas, that's not important. What's important is that she got the child to school on time. So she values the child's education, right? If we can see that instead of the other things, I think that helps us build authentic relationships in a way where we're not judging families, right? And then families don't feel disconnected or they're not welcome because we're not placing judgment on them. We don't have to censor them, right? We can, help them show what their strengths are and share power with families and all of those types of things that sometimes we do after the fact and not, as a part of the work, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. I'm curious before we move on, is the term family engagement. I've spent a lot of time thinking about that word, right? Because in a way it's a little one directional, right? I'm the expert and I'm going to reach out to you, the family. I'm just curious your thoughts on that word, if there's a better word that you feel like we should move to using.
So when I used to work, when I was a home visitor, this is where I cut my teeth before coming into higher education. I was a home visitor for programs like Healthy Families and Parents to Teachers. And we would call our families that were in our program, we would call them participants, right, instead of clients,
Mm-hmm.
because we really wanted to uplift this idea that we were partnering with them
Mm-hmm.
and helping them, their choice though, right? Helping them move in the direction that they wanted to go, in their family. So when I think about family engagement, I also think about like partnership, right? Because it isn't this one, it's bi-directional.
Mm-hmm.
Families learn from us and we learn from families, right? And so again, going back to what I said about, viewing families from a strength-based perspective. When we do so, they teach us things too about ourselves. And then we can kind of deconstruct this idea that, we are the experts, or there's this hierarchical relationship because you are coming to the center for a service. So I am the expert, right? So I feel like, if we view families as partners in this work, because we have the same outcomes, right? We want, the best outcomes for children. So if we view families as partners and helping them teach us how they would like to be engaged, right? I think that makes the difference.
Appreciate that. Dr. Ardrey, as you noted in the introduction to the book, data shows there's a racial disparity in school discipline, with Black children being disproportionately suspended and expelled, even in preschool. How can early childhood educators disrupt this pattern and ensure discipline policies are developmentally appropriate and, more importantly, equitable?
Yeah, so I think so much of what Dr. Mead has said in the her previous responses hit this perfectly. It takes first self-reflection, right? You have to know your biases, you have to know your dispositions, but we also have to know our own upbringings, right? We have to know ourselves, because our moral compass, how we determine what's right and what's wrong and what's good behavior and bad behavior is based on who we are and how we were raised. And I always point out to educators, we have to determine what really matters, right? Is this really an issue? Is this really taken away from the child learning and their peers learning? If it's not, some things we just have to let slide, right? I also think it's important that we teach expectations. I think a lot of times we just assume, right? Like you all were talking about this universalism and this one size fits all. We assume that everyone has the same notions of what's appropriate and what's not appropriate. And we base all of that, right? We know on white middle class culture. And we forget that when students enter, they come from a whole nother background. When we're talking about Black children, in particular, Black boys, right? The way we communicate, the way we respond, all of these different things go into play. And when you look at the data on why they are being suspended and why they are being expelled, we see disrespect over and over and over. And so we have to ask ourselves, what does it mean to be, respectful? What does it mean to be disrespectful? Is it the tone of voice? All of these different things. If it doesn't matter and it's not impacting the child learning, we have to be mindful that, yeah, this may not be something that I prefer or that I like, but does it matter? And I think that's the biggest things when we look at these policies, we have to ask ourselves why, right? A lot of times I tell my students when I ask them, give me some rules that we should have or some expectations we should have in the classroom. And they give me this long list, right? And they're really just regurgitating everything that we had to do when we were in school. But then when we get down to the explain to me why this is important, they're stumped. Like they don't, because we just have to do it. But why? Yeah. If I was a child, how would you explain to me why this is important? And a lot of times they realize like, I can't really explain. So I was like, let's take that off the list, right? And so when we start going through that, we have a much smaller list than what we think we should have. And so I think it's just a constant check of ourselves, right? That is this just a pet peeve of mine? Does it really matter at the end of the day or not? And just being mindful how we approach those things in the classroom and look at who are these rules impacting and affecting the most. And I think that's the best way to start, right? Taking ourselves out of it and just staying mindful of what is the main purpose in this classroom? What is the goal? And if this really does not take away from the end goal, then it doesn't need to be a rule and the children don't need to be penalized for it.
I appreciate that. I appreciate the why, right? Like, because so many times, even in life, even with adults, like there's something we have to do. There's a why, right? We need, and we deserve, and that shows respect that we talk to people about. It's just, this is what it is, and this is why it is.
Exactly.
It seems like dress codes are something that I thought of when you said that too, was when we're having rules about how children's hair should be or shouldn't be, or what shoes they can wear, or there's so much value judgment in that too, and much of that has little, if anything, to do with how a child learns.
Yeah. And if we're honest, a lot of times we use rules to gatekeep, right? We can't come out and say we don't want you here or we don't want this here. So we create these rules that's like, no, this is just the standard that we all have to meet, but it's really a way of gatekeeping and controlling who's in the room.
That was a powerful statement what you just said.
Yeah, and I think too, like going back to Dr. Ardrey's point about gatekeeping, like that gatekeeping is rooted in whiteness, right? Like, the ideals of what professionalism look like, the tone of voice, your hair, your dress, how you behave, whiteness set the standards for our educational system of what things should and should not be. And so deconstructing those, like Dr. Ardrey said, like what's the why behind it, right? If it's not really important, not impacting the child's ability to learn, then why do we even have that to begin with, right? So, and also, I mean, like it's not, we didn't talk. It's not a question here, but we have to be really mindful when we single children out or we penalize them, because what does that do to their self-esteem and their self-worth and their identity, right? And how they think and feel about themselves. And we know that, Black children internalize a lot of racist messages that circulate in our society, right? They internalize, these messages, and they have feelings of shame and rage about who they are, and confusion, right? And so I think as the adults and the educators in their lives, like we have a responsibility to create environments where we are affirming their identities and not gatekeeping, like Dr. Ardrey said.
We're also teaching all the other children in the classroom how to treat and regard that child too, when we call them out or single them out. And
That's right.
Speaking of identities and kind of seeing yourself in the classroom, Dr. Ardrey, with increasing limitations on certain books and topics and historical discussions in schools, how can educators find creative ways to incorporate diverse stories and perspective into the classrooms? You talked a little bit about this with music earlier. And what strategies can they use to navigate those conversations with concerned parents who may escalate a book choice or a classroom discussion to administrators, a school board, or even the media?
So I think for the first part, the way to, incorporate creative ways to address, culture and historical things is use the lived experiences of the children, right? There are multiple stories in your classroom right there, that you can make personal connections to. I also think it's important, especially when it comes to controversy. And I know it's really hard right now because whether, we want to acknowledge it or not, there is a very clear mark in the sand of who's valued and who's not. And I think it's important as educators that we, this is kind of a hill we should die on, that each and every child in our classroom is important and they should be valued. And part of them being valued is them seeing themselves in what we're teaching, how we're teaching it, right? And so we need to do these things and we need to read certain books and do certain things because we want them to see themselves in the context of what they're learning. And I think we get so caught up on it being culturally relevant, or it's about this and it's about that, but it's really just teaching in context. If we think about ourselves, when do we learn best? When we care about what we're learning about, right? And so it's just finding a way to bridge that gap between home and school to position every child for success. And I think when we take those things away, we're going to see this continuing repetition of this gap in what we call achievement and all of these different things. But it's really just more about the opportunity to learn in the way that best suits you. And I think we just have to make it very clear to parents and principals and whomever. I always tell my students, know your why and be able to articulate it. Why are you doing this and how is it benefiting the children? And, take data, right? When I do it this way, I've known that the children are gaining this. When I do it this way, I've learned that they have gained that. Because as long as you have your why and you have the data that backs up, nobody can really argue it other than being like, I just don't want you to do it. And I feel like if it gets to that point, then you need to make some tough decisions about, is this the environment that is best suited for you to do your best as an educator, right? All you can do, I think Dr. Mead referred to this before, is what you can control in your classroom. And I think being an advocate, for those children, knowing your why and being able to document how it's beneficial is the best way to kind of navigate those difficult terrains.
And if I can piggyback really quickly, I think there is a misconception that culturally relevant teaching is for Black children and other children of color only, right? It's not. It's just like Dr. Ardrey said, it's good teaching. It's just good practice, right? And so when we can make the connection that culturally relevant teaching, culturally responsive practice, anti-racist practice, all of these things, right? Because to Emily's point, when she said it teaches other children how to treat those children or how to interact with those children, right? It's good teaching. It's just good practice. The reality is we don't live in a homogenized society. We live in a multicultural, diverse society with children that are multilingual, not even bilingual, children that are multiracial, right? And so we do ourselves, justice when we are creating these types of environments because we teach children early. Early childhood education is just in a prime position to help young children learn those diverse and global skills that are so needed to help them function, in the world, right? And to, reduce the incidence of prejudice and stereotypes and all of those types of things. Like, wouldn't it be awesome if 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 we didn't have wouldn't it be it's fine to have categories, different social categories and identities, that's fine, but we don't have to assign value to them. And wouldn't it be awesome if children knew that early on, right?
Appreciate that. Dr. Ardrey, I have one more question for you. For educators who are committed to equity but fear saying the wrong thing, what advice do you have? And how can we move beyond that fear and actively contribute to meaningful change in the way that prioritizes the voices and experiences of marginalized communities?
So I think the first thing I would say is don't fear the inevitable because you are probably going to say something that does not come out the way that you expected it to or the way that you intended to. A lot of that is based on the perception of the other individual. But I will say with that, I think the most important thing is being willing to learn and take accountability, right? Knowing that, even though that's not what I intended for it to do, the impact that it has on whomever you say it to, right? Be willing to take accountability for that. Be willing to apologize, right? If you sincerely feel that, and just ask for direction and to learn and to do the self-work and to do, the research on, well, what's the best way of saying, having open conversations, having the uncomfortable conversations. All of those things will position you. It is a learning curve. Like Dr. Mead says, it's not just I get to this destination and I stop. Like you're always learning, right? Even us, right, as Black women, like when we have a different conversation, me and Dr. Mead have had so many conversations and we feel differently now than when we felt differently before because of different contexts. And I just think you have to understand that it is an ongoing journey. Things change all the time, but being willing to take accountability, being willing to admit when you don't know, and being willing to learn is more important than the fear. And so I think do it scared is what I would say. Do it scared, even if you're scared. Yeah.
I love that phrase, do it scared. I mean, I think that's such an important phrase. Dr. Mead, this follows that kind of many educators want to do this work, but they feel isolated or unsupported by their administration or community. How can they build networks of support and resilience when pushing for equity in difficult environments?
So it's like finding your people, right?
Yeah.
Finding those who value the work the same as you and build small, small communities, right? I mean, that's what a community is, right? You're together with people that have a shared purpose, right? And you create shared meaning around that, that purpose. So I would say, find people that share your interest, that share your desire to continue this work. Stephanie from Gryphon House, we had a conversation the other day, and we both went into that meeting like, uh, and not that we didn't want to meet with each other, but we were feeling very heavy with everything that is going on in our society, just because we are advocates of equity work, and particularly equity in early childhood education. And after we got off that call, we felt so energized because we were in community. Even if it was just the two of us, we were in community with each other, and we needed that. We didn't know that going in. We were just feeling very heavy, and neither of us wanted to cancel the meeting because we had already rescheduled. But so I would say, I think that's the most important thing to do, is to find your people, find people that are willing to do it scared with you, right? That are willing to die on this sword, right? And those are the people that you build community with. Those are the people that you come up with creative ways to do things. I facilitate a community of learners with a university in the northeastern part, and I've been with them for 4 years. And in that space, we know that we can talk about the hard conversations. They know that I'm going to challenge them to continue to do the work despite. Now, of course, I am not saying to people that you need to go out there and lose your job. I'm not saying that, right?
Yeah.
I'm not saying that. But I am saying that there's ways to do the work, right? There's ways to kind of go around. For example, the community of practice that I facilitate, we have to change the name, right? You have to change the name of it. That's aesthetics. Fine. You want to change the name? Whatever, right? But we're still going to do the work. So if you don't want us to say biases, okay, fine, then we're just going to say assumptions, right? Like we're still going to do the work, and we're still going to get the message across, because if the work wasn't important, why would they try to stop the work from happening, right? So we know that the work is important. We know that it has value. And so I think that goes back to what I said earlier about, like building your capacity to continue to educate yourself and be engaged in the work. So you have the right tools, you have the right to be able to name something when you see it and call it out, to call someone else in when they are, inadvertently or on purpose, doing something that that is anti-whatever, right? And so I think it's just building your community and being open to learn, practicing cultural humility, because that's what cultural humility is, this continued openness and willingness to learn, examine issues of inequities and parity where they exist, examine the spaces that you are in, where there is distance in those spaces, where those spaces are not welcoming, and then how do you use your privilege to be able to create spaces that are more welcoming, understanding intersectionality, right? Because our children, we as people, we're not just one dimensional, right? And the children that we support, they're not just one dimensional, right? So going back to what I said earlier, affirming identities. So I think there's so many different things that, you can do, within those spaces. But I think it just starts with like finding your people and connecting with your people that, believe in this work 10 toes down, regardless of whatever happened. And then, like Dr. Ardrey said, you might have to have some, hard conversations with yourself. Like, okay, is this the place that I need to be? Because I can't be my authentic self if I can't do what I know is the best, right? We are, regardless of what folks think, we are on the right side of history with this. We are.
Yeah.
So.
I appreciate that. Speaking of community, I think this next question kind of flows with that. The book discusses using professional learning communities, however you kind of call, they can be called different things, and reflective practice to drive real action. Can you give examples of what a school or center's leadership team should be doing to regularly assess and improve that equity in their program?
So, I would say one thing, like if you have regular meetings, that is a prime opportunity to be discussing things that you can do differently to promote diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, and justice, right? And access, all of those things, right? So a question that you can ask in the meeting is, what did I do this week, right? To promote one of those things, right? And then you all can brainstorm on how you can continue to do those things. Like what went well. What I have my the folks that I'm facilitating this community of practice with is we're looking at SWOT. We're looking at strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. And then we go through areas where they want to see improvement. So for example, if it's better interactions with the teachers, like the TAs don't have, they need to strengthen their interactions with the teachers. Let's just say that's an area that they want to improve. Then how do we use SWOT to do that, right? So whatever the issue is that they want to improve or change, we use that kind of analysis because that helps us not only look at the strengths, but what opportunities already exist, and then what are the threats, right, that can prevent us from doing so. And I think if you, and I'm not saying you have to use that framework, right, but if you use something like that to help you dive deeper into what you want to challenge, into what you want to change, like that's some action that you can take that's practical, and then it holds you accountable, right? And then creating like an action plan, like, okay, this month, this is what we're going to do. It's often helpful to start with the low-hanging fruit because some things are so ingrained in the system that it takes time to change. But if there's low-hanging fruit that you can identify, then applying like a SWOT or appreciative inquiry framework, whatever kind of strength-based framework you want to use, to help you get to the end result, which is making that change. And I think the other thing that's really important here is just the value of transformative learning theory, like really understanding how important it is to be able to take in information, because that's what learning is. Learning is an iterative process, right? So you take in information, you learn something new, you give it a whirl, you give it a try, see if it works out. If it doesn't, then you make adjustments, right? That's what learning is. And just also making room for mistakes. Like Dr. Ardrey said, you're going to make some mistakes, so give yourself some grace, in that. But I think if you come with a framework where you can tie that to some action that you want to do and hold yourself accountable, then that helps you to stay engaged. And engagement was one of the things that I mentioned early at the beginning of this. So I think those are just some things that people can do.
So
and
important.
just to add on to what Dr. Mead said too, being mindful of who is at the table, who is the leadership team, and making sure that they reflect the population you serve, right? Because that will help the decisions be authentic, and it will help you, keep in mind the stakeholders and what they desire and what they need. And so I think a lot of times our leadership teams don't always reflect the population we serve. And even though you may be well-intentioned and all of those different things, there are just some blind spots that you have, no matter how, well-intentioned you are. So just making sure that your leadership team is reflective of the people you serve in some capacity.
Appreciate that. I have one last question for both of you. So what is one advice you would give to an early childhood educator or leader who is just starting to learn about systemic inequities in education? Where should they begin? And what's the most important first step they can take? I'll let you go
You
first.
want me to start?
Yeah,
I can go. Where they can begin is with self, right? Like it's a self-reflective, ongoing, process. And, some questions they can ask themselves are things like, what values do I hold about education? What beliefs do I have? What ways, kind of like what Dr. Ardrey said earlier, like what ways have I've been socialized around education, right? What are my beliefs about education? How does that show up in the classroom, right? So I think they can start, with self. And then it's important to understand the systemic equities within our society and how they translate. So having historical knowledge, right? Learning new terms. And if those terms make you uncomfortable, sitting with that, like sitting with those terms and figuring out why it makes you uncomfortable, what triggers you, connecting with other people that are beginning to do this work. Do not rely on Black people or other people of color to teach you. Right? The onus does not fall on our shoulders, right? We can be, co-thinkers together, but we're not here to teach you what happened, right? Because that re-triggers us, right? So, don't expect that. Be quiet and listen. Listen to the voices of folks that are marginalized and have close proximity to the issue, right? So yeah, I'll let Dr. Ardrey chime in, but I think those are some things that can and check your whiteness. And if you don't know what that means, that's what the community of learners is for, to help you understand.
Yeah. I think, Dr. Mead pretty much summed it up. The only thing that I would say is just to take the time to build authentic relationships with people who aren't like you, because you learn so much just from building authentic relationships. And once you have those relationships, you do have those safe spaces to have the difficult conversations and to ask questions you may not normally feel comfortable asking, and to make those mistakes, right? Because that person will know, like, this person is well intended, but let me help you understand, right? And so it doesn't feel so burdensome when I have to kind of help and clarify some things, when it's built on an authentic relationship versus me being your source, like me being your source for all things Black. And what do I need to do? And so I just think relationships go a long, long way.
I want to always give space. Is there anything else that you didn't have the opportunity to lift up or share, or that you want to make sure we talk about today?
I think I like what Dr. Ardrey said, like, do it with fear. I think we are so caught up right now, in what's happening, and like we live in an anti-DEI climate, right? I think we first have to understand what diversity, equity, and inclusion is, because I think in some spaces it's being reduced to who it has benefited, right? And not really understanding the full, like what it really is, right? Yes, let me say that differently. Who it has benefited the most, right? Like, I'm seeing a lot of those types of conversations, but not really understanding the full gamut of what diversity, equity, inclusion is, and what it should be, right? And and creating space for really examining issues of inequities and parity, right? You can't talk about diversity and inclusion in absence of that, right? You can't talk about the ways that we should connect to people, if we are not examining what these, how these systemic barriers have been in place that make that, yeah, that create the conditions that marginalized folks find themselves in, right? So I just think that that's just, it's really important. And then it's also, super important to understand that diversity, equity, and inclusion work is not anti-racist work. Similar, but it's not the same. And that we have to create space to examine race and race relations and issues, and we can't be afraid to do that. It's such a taboo topic and continues to be, especially in the current climate that we're living in now. Like, we can't do this work authentically if we're not talking about those hard issues that, make people cringe or uncomfortable. And that's okay, right? Because if we don't do that in an authentic way, we're going to continue to have, you know, the United States will never live up to its ideals. And I think one thing I always say is that, white supremacy culture, it robs white people of their humanity and robs people of color, Black folks and people of color, of their dignity, right? And so once white individuals and people as a group understand that they too have been impacted by white supremacy, then that's when we can get to the nitty gritty.
Mm-hmm.
That's when we can start having, real conversations.
Mm-hmm.
Hashtag do it scared.
Yeah. A couple hashtags / mantras to come out of this, I think are so helpful for myself and for our community. Dr. Mead, Dr. Ardrey, it's been such an honor to spend time with you today, kind of discussing these important topics that are important every day, but especially right now. So thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for your Gryphon House book. And I look forward to continuing this conversation in the future.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
And I'm just really grateful to all of you for your time and labor and in sharing your knowledge and expertise with us and just being so candid. I want to acknowledge again the depth of experience and wisdom that is represented here today. It's really, like Rebecca said, such an honor. And you provided so many actionable things that educators and educational leaders can do right now to stay afloat and stay hopeful in this challenging and changing landscape around education and so many other things that we're facing in the United States today. So again, I'm just very grateful to all of you for being here.
Thank you.
Dr. Tameka Ardrey, Dr. Ebonyse Mead, I speak for Dr. Berlin and myself and everyone at Gryphon House in expressing our gratitude for your time and expertise today. These conversations are difficult and essential. As Dr. Ardrey said, we must do it scared. Equity work isn't about perfection. It's about showing up, learning, and taking action. To all the educators listening, keep pushing forward. Your work matters, and every child deserves to be seen and valued. Thanks for tuning in to Early Childhood Chapters. See you next time.